Why? Their aim was to confront and crush the United Nations. The vast armies of China had joined the war.
Almost overnight, the men of the United Nations faced a very different enemy. The Chinese were tough. They were battle-hardened veterans of years of civil war, expert in close-quarters fighting and used to the rugged terrain. What really set them apart as a fighting force is that they were highly politicized. Each man had to sign a pledge of commitment to the cause, and each unit had to swear an oath to destroy imperialism.
They warned us if we didn't wipe out the enemy in Korea now, one day they would come back to China and we would lose everything. We swore to triumph in the communist cause and protect everything the revolution had won for us. We weren't ever going to be oppressed by imperialists again.
The Chinese may have been rugged and determined, but their real advantage lay in the sheer vastness of their numbers. The UN, on the other hand, relied on completely different strategies. Rather than the massed use of troops travelling swiftly and silently across open countryside, the UN had fewer troops, relying on road-bound tanks and artillery. Artillery was the key weapon that would form the bedrock of the Allied battle plan.
Dan and I were given the chance to experience what it's like to be under live artillery fire when we visited the bombard shelter of the British Royal School of Artillery.
A converge, a PD, a 2 rounds.
At my command, a 1 round fire for effect.
A 3 on the 5.
Ones are a fire over.
Even in this bunker, you can actually feel the shockwaves go through you, can't you?
Are you telling me you can? How critical is the artillery defending a position like this against imagining these waves of Chinese attacking?
Absolutely vital. The contribution that artillery makes in delaying the enemy, taking them out, taking out large numbers, which have been absolutely critical with the Chinese because they did the human wave tactics, was vital. Lethal effect would probably be about 150 metres in a circle, taking people out. That would be killing them, and then the actual damage will go out to about 200 or 300 metres.
Extraordinary, isn't it?
And that effect would be continuous, day or night, all weathers, 24 hours a day. That's what you would receive.
The effect on an enemy out there is absolutely devastating.
Even inside the reinforced bunker, we could feel the force of the explosions. But it was only out in the open that we could see the impact those explosions would have on an enemy attack. So these shells, they're basically just like giant hand grenades.
Absolutely, and that's the effect we're after.
Each shell breaks up into hundreds of fragments?
Thousands of fragments.
Thousands of fragments.
Yeah, the air would have been black with those fragments. And I've got some here, which we fired today actually, a whole range. The optimum size is probably this one. And if you just look at that, you'll see how heavy and sharp.
That's just a jagged edge.
One of those will kill someone, of course it will.
Easily, easily. These two here would have taken this chap's arms off. This one here would have killed him. That one up the top is a serious head wound. And the last one on here would have hurt his leg.
And yet they came on, the Chinese. They came on and on
They still
through
came
this
on,
stuff.
weight of numbers. But as they're coming forward, you know, they're encountering their comrades, wounded, injured, screaming. Do they keep going? Do they help them out? What do they do? The whole time we're just sapping the momentum out of this attack.
But no matter how lethal the artillery fire, it did little to stem the massed attacks of the Chinese army.
We swarmed into action like ants. The enemy guns overheated with the continuous use. They began to misfire and could no longer hit their targets. In the end, they would see so many people coming at them, they would panic.
One after another, United Nations positions were simply overwhelmed by wave after wave of Chinese infantry. Some United Nations units fought hard. Others fell back in disarray. Generally, morale collapsed, and to make matters worse, the bitter Korean winter was setting in. By late November 1950, with the temperature well below 0 degrees, men of both sides were fighting at the limit of human endurance. The Chinese soldiers were wearing only lightly padded cotton uniforms and thin canvas shoes to protect them against the bitter cold. The Allies fared little better, and much of their equipment simply seized up. The men had to keep themselves awake for fear of freezing to death as they slept.
The first night the Chinese hit us, I lost 39 men to frostbite. The next afternoon, I went down to the medical station, and the doctors were breaking off all those frozen toes with forceps. I never saw those men again. I lost a whole platoon to frostbite.
Fighting a war in these dire conditions was not what these men had expected. To make matters worse, some American Marines found themselves surrounded at a place called Choi Sin. Despite relentless Chinese attacks, the Americans managed to fight their way out. But elsewhere on the battlefield, other soldiers couldn't cope. Without waiting for orders, some turned around and fled.
We moved headlong, helter-skelter, trying to get to the port at Busan. It was disgusting. Unbelievable. I never felt so ashamed in all of my life as to be a part of an army that was running away.
Allied defences were crumbling across practically the entire front line. The United Nations generals had no choice. They ordered a full-scale withdrawal. It was the largest military withdrawal in US history. As the Chinese drove south, the United Nations Army folded in front of them. And by January 1951, the Americans and their allies had been thrown back south of Seoul. Once again, the South Korean capital was in the hands of the communists. But this proved a step too far. Because the Chinese had moved so far south, their supply lines were now severely strained. And the tide turned yet again. The UN Army once more began to push north. Over the first weeks of 1951, the Allies clawed their way back to a line just north of Seoul, but just south of the old border. After 7 months of seesawing, advance and withdrawal, once more, the two sides were practically back to where they'd been when the war began. The huge, sweeping moves of the two sides up and down the peninsula subsided into an apparent stalemate. But how to break this stalemate was to lead to a crisis at the very highest level of the American leadership. The American president, Harry Truman, did not want to do anything to escalate the war in Korea. But General MacArthur still demanded total victory over his communist enemy. MacArthur believed his president's policy was too timid, and he was going to say so loud and clear. In order to achieve total victory, he demanded that the war should be taken into China itself. What MacArthur was proposing was not simply to attack China, but to have the option of attacking it with nuclear weapons. This war was threatening to go nuclear. With MacArthur now publicly challenging Washington policy, President Truman had to make a decision, and he made a brave one.
I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea for these vital reasons: to make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted, to see that the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and to prevent a third world war. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
MacArthur's dismissal marked the end of an era, the end of the Allied aim to unite the two Koreas under a democratic flag. MacArthur's job went to General Matthew Ridgway, a man both liked and respected by his ground troops, and a man who accepted the idea of a divided Korea. Ridgway's aim was to establish a defensible line in the mountains and rivers just north of Seoul, from where he could keep the communists at bay. But the Chinese commander, Peng Dehuai, had an entirely different plan. He wanted to demolish the Allied forces and throw them out of Korea once and for all. Unknown to the mainly British and American soldiers who were starting to dig in, China's vast armies were preparing to launch a massive attack, their spring offensive.
As night fell on the 22nd of April 1951, hundreds of thousands of North Korean and Chinese troops prepared to attack right along the battlefront, marked here in the western section of the peninsula by the Imjin River, only 30 miles from Seoul. These Chinese troops were masters of infiltration and concealment. Morale was high. Confident of victory, the Chinese leaders told their men that they'd be celebrating May Day in the streets of Seoul. That night, the Chinese took their positions along the banks of the Imjin and lay in wait for the order to move.
The Chinese commander, Peng Dehuai's plan was for a huge coordinated attack, practically from coast to coast. And the aim of his spring offensive, to destroy entire UN divisions by swamping them with sheer weight of numbers, carving them up into small pockets and wiping them out one by one. Then he'd move to recapture Seoul. Peng ordered the North Koreans to bring pressure on the east end of the line here. But the main attack would be by the Chinese themselves, punching a hole through the line in 3 places, against mostly South Korean forces here, American forces here, and here, in the west, where I am now, the Chinese put a large force up against the mainly British 29th Brigade.